Tonight we are having the privilege of having Charles Abrams, who just wrote his first book called Class Action. I know Charles Abrams when he was very young. Very young. We were neighbors. We were neighbors in Elsie's River, where we stayed together. Our families were collectively, I will use the word forcibly removed, under slum clearance from Elsie's River to Nooitgedacht. And when we arrived in Nooitgedacht, both the roads that we stay in, Farrell Road and Breamway, were the last line of what they called the koophuise. You know that word, ne? Koophuise. And there was a clear field, and then on the other side was Bishop Lavis. And soon we moved in, and new construction happened. So all the people in the koophuise were inside, and then they started to build masonettes and flats, and Charles will take the story from there. Okay? But we grew up together. Charles became a student eventually. He went to school with my sister Anita. They were in the same class in primary school and in high school. And they were great friends, these two. I think Anita spends a lot of time in Charles's house, talking through issues, etc., etc. But Charles kind of went to university. And in fact, my dad, there's a chapter in the book where, where he had asked my dad's assistants to get him into university. And, yes, and his idea of university, or getting into university, was getting a law degree. And my dad helped and got him into the theology school. And he will tell that story too, but it's a very interesting story of how he got back into the university. And so he studied, but funds had made it very difficult. And so he studied through UNISA. He had, UWC, yeah. And then later on, he operated an advice office from his mother's lounge, okay? And later on, he studied and became a lawyer. I will pause it there because I don't want to spoil this conversation. That's going to happen here. But I think where I meet Charles again is here at the Black Sash. He will also tell his own story about how the Black Sash has helped him. But I meet him, and when I became the national director of the Black Sash here, the Black Sash was involved in the bread price fixing case. Okay? And there were 2 or 3 cases running parallel, and the Black Sash together with COSATU, Western Cape, I think, and the Children's Center, Resource Center, walked the long journey of getting class action. But he and the conversation will talk a little bit more. So I'm just giving an introduction to how Black Sash has and Charles Abrams' journey intersect with each other. So I want to start the conversation by asking Charles to tell us about Breamway. That is where he grew up. And that journey gets him, or his path crossed with social justice because of the experiences there. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Lynette. What a wonderful introduction, how kind, and in fact, what a great summary up to almost half of the book, in such a short, point of time. I think you've really done a, wonderful job, but also just to set, the context, of the book that I have written. So when one think, about class action, we think about immediately law, and then we immediately think, oh no, this might be a difficult read. In fact, when you think of class struggle, and you say, oh, politics. So if you take the interplay between class action and class struggle together, then you get the sense of what this book is about. But then you reduce it further, and you reduce it not at the big level of big-time politics, etc., but the individual's experience in all of the class struggle, in ultimately getting to the point of being engaged in what we call class action. And it's really the sense of what this book is about. So talking about Brimway, and Brimway is the place where I wasn't born there, but I moved there when I was about 5 years old. And as Lynette has said, it was as a result of as a direct result of the forced removals that were in place, at the time. When we talk about forced removals these days, we all, look at it and say, oh, well, these are these, shameful events of the past, where people will move, etc. And it is also, and many people have written, and there's, I think it's a very, good history about it. What I sought to do here was to portray the deep psychological impact that forced removals have had on hundreds of thousands, if not millions of us. And of course, we need to see forced removals in the context of, the land disposition. So the idea, behind this was to really portray in a very deep sense those deep emotional scars on each one of us, but of course, through my lived experience. So when we moved to Nooit Gedacht, at the time we were staying in Elsies River. But we were staying in, I grew up in a shack. I was born in a shack. My father called it the sinkhockey. And there's a part where I said, when every time when there was a little bit of rain, ours was, almost the first, to be knee deep, in water. So when the idea came up and my father came home and said that we were going to move, and had spoken to the municipal officials, etc., it was so wonderful. You can imagine, 4 or 5 years old, you're ecstatic, you're, overjoyed, and etc. And so the evening when we moved, of course it was, I spent the first 4 or 5 years of my life, in the shack. They were wonderful experiences, but they were also not so wonderful experiences. I described one of the scenes of, the pit toilet. It was one of my dreadful experiences. It's so etched in my childhood. Every time you've got to go, to the toilet, I remember how my mother would drag me off. I refused to. And until, she could, she relented. And then I started using the toilet around the shack. And, the thing is that, when, people look from the outside, they think, how dirty, what is it that, people can live like this? But without realizing the deep psychological aspects, as children, when you're confronted, when you're faced and you're in those kind of situations. So the trauma that you go into a little toilet and you sit down and it's all dark and it's the stench and all of that. I remember that. So it was a wonderful time, the idea that it was a brick house and we're moving to a brick house. And when we got there, here I was just overwhelmed by the idea that, a day earlier I was in a shack and here I was in a brick house. The sense of just having electricity. I remember how we ran, up and down, etc. And so all of those little experiences I still remember. But as time went on, and Nooit Gedacht started, and particularly Brimway revealed itself, I started realizing, but here's something not so lekker. Here's something wrong. As Lynette explained, so we were in Brimway in particularly. We were the only Koophuis, the only in that one. And then you have Forelway, where, you know, Lynette and, you know, family and the others, you know, grew up. There were also little, you know, there were a few more, you know, Koophuise, but also those who had what we call the scheme houses. And I think quite familiar. But in Breamway, you had, opposite Breamway, you had the flats. The 2-story flats, and you still have it, and the 4-story flats. And in time, I discovered, but you know what, these were not the ideas that I had in mind as a child, because, you know, they were talking about colored, and the only colored that I could think of is colorful, because you make those kind of connections. So colored might, you know, means colorful. So if you move to a colored place, it's, you know, there must be something colorful about, you know, this. And so this was, and I said, you know, with my first childhood, I said, but why, you know, you've got, you know, these constructions, I don't see the nice picket fences, I don't see the greenery, you know, and so on. But in time, part of that developed. But that was a different part of Nuitgedacht. And the part where I grew up in, I soon discovered that this was the most poorest of the township. Soon Nuitgedacht became, Breamway became the place in Nuitgedacht that would become the Slaughter Street. Because that was the place where the rival gangs from the flats and Breamway, remind me very nicely of that. The flats just opposite, you know, where we grew up, we'd call the Vaal Flats, but the real name for it is the Skurveflatse. And the ones a little bit further down, we call the Pink Flatse. And I think people, you know, are familiar. And that's where I grew up. And in time, that became, that street, the junction of Breamway and Barracuda Street, you know, became the place where gangs would come, and that's where they would duel. And our house was right at the epicenter. And so for my entire childhood, it is almost as if I've lived within that, the gang warfare that has taken place. As if, you know, today we're talking about 3D, you know, and, you know, virtual reality. That was my life. That was my baptism. This was almost, and I think it perhaps an exaggeration, but weekly, monthly, this is what I've seen. And so as a child, I was very young when I saw the first slaughter of how young men got killed, and in the most brutal way, with pangas. Not today where they shoot each other. That was the day times of pangas. You know, when you scrape the pangas across the street, the others, you know, have, you know, bricks, you know, in their hands, and they would duel each other. And the moment one of the opposing, you know, gang, you know, member, you know, had fallen, that is the, you know, time of the attack. But the irony of it is very interesting, is that my father, and we deal with it, was also a lay preacher. But because of that, he had a big Volkswagen VW van. Call it, what do we call it? A VW combi, a camper. Okay? And it was because we were a very big family. So we'll get there. 11 children in total. But it was also to ferry the congregation, you know, congregants and so on. And so whenever one of the members had fallen, they were either stabbed or, you know, whatever with the panga, so on. Our house was the one where they would come and knock for transport. Whether it is of, you know, the gang in Breamway or of the gang in the Vaal Flats, our house was the port of call. In a way, it provided a sense of safety for the family to be able to move across territory. But that was my experience. So this was my very first-hand experience of seeing the bloody business of gangsterism. What exacerbated this problem was that people were uprooted from areas where they stayed in Goodwood, the Akkers, and other places. to make way, for white people. And they were stacked on top of each other, literally stacked right on top of each other. And of course, what we see today on the Cape Flats is the dastardly consequences, human consequences, social, emotional, and the deep psychological scars of what has remained. So this is my experience. So when I describe Brimway, in the book I describe it as the way in which I think it was the Italian 14th century poet Dante Alighieri, when he and the Roman poet Virgil came to, they were going through what they call the 9 circles of hell. And when they got to this post, vir diegene wat Afrikaans is, die geween en die gekners van tande, the moaning and, all this, the wailing of, of people. And say, and Virgil was asking him, so what is happening here? And it is, the inscription, the 14th century poet was that those, and it's a wonderful, and it might be, very, if I may just, read that, for you, because here we go. So there's a wonderful inscription, in Dante's Inferno, where he describes his journey through the 9th circle of hell. And he was accompanied by the Roman poet Virgil. And so when they get to the gates of hell, they are met by the inscription, through me you pass into the city of woe. Through me you pass into eternal pain. All hopes are abandoned here, you who enter. And that was really my experience of Brimway. Anyone who wants to go to Brimway now, it seems as if it almost become 10 times worse. So that's Brimway. And that's where I emerged from.
I know both your mother and your father, and all the 11 children that she gave birth to. And I've read about the excitement of being in Brimway, and the picket fence, and establishing a garden, and your excitement when you put the spade into the soil, and then oozes out a whole lot of water because you burst a pipe. And you ran into the house, your mother being a little bit more comforting. But in that process, you begin to describe the patriarchal relationship in your family, and particularly compounded by religion, compounded by a whole range of other factors that ended up with your mother suffering the consequences on your behalf. So I'm going to leave it at that. And can you talk us through just those patriarchal relationships and the relationship, the consequences for women in particular, and your mother in that setting?
Thanks. So yeah, I was being in this situation in Nooit Gedacht, in Brimway in particular, and I've already gotten the sense that this community that I was now awakening as a child, that there were some serious problems within this community. In fact, the social fabric of it, in my own childhood way, I realized that there is something wrong. Okay? The cohesion, cohesion as a community, etc. So what does one do? You see all the gang fights outside. So you retreat to where you feel the safest. And that's into the family. But that only lasted for a very short while. My father was one of the most loving persons. He was a lay preacher, So he worked as a truck driver, and at night, he did work as a lay preacher. Now, I come from a tradition what they call the Hanneklopkerkies, so the hand-clapping churches. And I think many of you, the Pentecostal people, the people, clap. So that's the tradition that I come from. And my father was, deeply, into, the church, and he devoted most of his life up and until, when he died, last year. He was deeply devoted. But yet, as a child, my first experience of this duality, this light and dark sense of my father got revealed when, innocently, my brother and myself, we were trying to make a garden. And there's a subtext to that. Because everybody else's gardens in the rest of, Nooit Gedacht was really, really growing very, very nicely, beautifully. And we felt out. But there was the sense, and I'll come back to the theme of, whiteness. Because there was a theme around that, where Nooit Gedacht you could see that there was a part that was what we call the posh part. And there was a part that was just, we used to call it the locals. So the posh and the locals. And we were right down in the locals. But even in the locals, you had little tiers. We were right at the bottom. Right there. And so we thought, my brother and I, let's, maybe we can, bring a little bit of sense and semblance to, Breamway. That was really, really just, Breamway was just down in the gutters. And so I was busy with the spade, and the next moment, all hell broke loose because, I had gotten the spade into a pipe. And it also shows you the kind of construction that they had. They, these water pipes, etc., were just, laid there, etc., and it doesn't matter if it was on the surface or so on. And so what happened was that, I knew something was going to come. So there was a whole commotion. But my main concern was, what was my father going to say tonight? Am I going to get a hiding? And so the night when he came home from work and from church, just interesting, I was laying under the blankets. I'd already pulled my head over. My mother opened the door, and there, he was. And she'd prepared the food because, this is the thing. When the husband comes home, that food must be ready. No matter, they don't give time. That food must be ready and it must be warm. So women has got to make sure that the food is ready and it must be warm. Because he's the man in the house, he provides. And so she had his food ready, it was warm, etc. And then I heard the conversation that she was saying that something happened because unfortunately no one had come to fix the water, so the mains had been switched off. And then she said, she accidentally caused, in the pipe. And she was very sorry, and we're sitting without water and so on. And I was quite relieved, and I couldn't for the moment understand why she did, but then I realized that it was all an attempt at trying to, ensure that I'm not getting, a hell of a hiding. The next moment, all hell broke loose. And I pulled my, the blanket over my head. And that night, I experienced a different side of my father. He literally killed my mother, Yeah, and, the anguish that, came from that, the scream and the shout and say, stop me, stop me, stop me. That was the brutality that came out that night. It was almost impossible from a man so highly religious to a man that flipped in that way and exerted the greatest brutality that I'd experienced as a young person. And I couldn't understand, I couldn't reconcile that. When we got up, we went, out. And so the following morning, that scene continued. And I've never seen my mother like that. And my father then left. That was my experience of then realizing that not only was the society and the community around me broken, but the very place that I thought, would provide comfort and security disintegrated and became broken. But, you know, when you experience this, of course, there's hindsight. But as a child, it's a different sense that you have. You experience it, that's most of all. You're trying to make sense, but you're not trying to make sense in the way that I'm able to rationalize this now. You just carry on, okay? You're clinging to this, and you're clinging to that, and you're clinging to that. But it is down, deep down in the psyche. It's a very interesting thing because my father would continue with this relationship, deeply religious, providing for the house religiously. Despite everything, he's never abandoned us. Every single day he would get up. He would go and work. He will bring back money. You know, as challenging as it was, you know, with his salary. Religious. But a person, a man who believed, and I don't know, I insinuate in the book that it might be because of giving literal expression to some of the biblical terms, that women, submit yourself, you know, to men, because men are the heads of the house. And I don't know whether this was a literal interpretation of biblical scriptures. And already because of that, I had deep issues with religion, you know, at the time, in my own way. Because the next aspect of the book, and I think we'll go to, is where I then thought, okay, well, if the community around me is disintegrating or has disintegrated, and then the house has disintegrated, the next thing, the school should be the place of safety. And I was in for a surprise.
Thank you very much, Lynette. It's always a pleasure to be able to be at the Khulumas with the Black Sash. And my thanks also to you, Charles. Thank you for having the courage, the strength of heart, the strength of character to write your story, to stand in the light of your story, to own it, and to produce a book that is at times excruciatingly candid, but always so incredibly hopeful, so incredibly rich, so incredibly meaningful. And it's a real pleasure to get to chat to you about it. So you and Lynette start us off, it's like Lynette was in my head. You start us off where I would have wanted to begin as well. And this is around physical location, right? So by your own description, you grow up on the edge of the dream, right? If the dream is to move into a brick house, you grow up right on the very edge of that, both physically in a literal sense, but also in terms of social standing, right? As you say, Breamway was right down there in terms of the social strata. So you grow up on the edge of a dream, but you also grow up in the center of violence, right? You grow up right at the crossroads between gang, war, turf, and you grow up in a highly, highly violent area. And so what immediately jumps out for me is this idea of navigating worlds. You moved through your life from one world, this world that is the entrance to hell, as you describe it, Nooit Gedacht, Breamway, into this other world, right? This world of the High Court, the Constitutional Court, you know, senior counsel, international scholarships, the world of law, right? And I'm interested in what it is that you would say is the thing that you learnt from the Breamway world, the Nooit Gedacht world, the 7 circles, 9 circles of hell world, that helped you to navigate this other world, this world of law, this world of, you know, senior counsel. And likewise, what that other world, the law world, taught you about understanding and engaging with your original world, the world of Breamway. So I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about that process of moving between worlds in the way you have.
Nolita, thank you so much. So, I mean, that's a jump, and I want to, you know, maintain that, you know, almost that thread, because, I mean, the question is so important. What enabled me after many, many years, and so people might think that, well, I eventually reached success. But I am, you know, putting success, you know, together with a question mark, okay? But for the moment, you know, we say that I eventually managed to overcome stroke escape that world in which I was born, in which I grew up, and in which I spent most of my childhood, all of my childhood, and most of my young adult life there. And now I'm Charles the lawyer, and we'll get to how I eventually got there. And one of the things that I said to myself is that, so my dream was I wanted to be a heart surgeon. And I was very, because I was so impressed by the idea of, my mother having told me the story about Chris Barnett. And I said to myself, wow, I believed, I'm going to be the next Chris Barnett. I mean, it was without a doubt. And then those hopes got brutally crashed at the age of 12 when a school inspector told me, when I told this story, they told me very clearly, don't aim too high. Okay? And so the idea of, and obviously the theme is about how not only the physical, putting, people and, moving them into, the most horrendous conditions through land dispossession, through, the Group, Areas Act, forced removals and so on. But the idea was also to ensure that you break the spirit so that the idea of Bantu education, was aimed at ensuring that you would have a docile pool of millions of black, and by that I mean black people, colored people, Indian people, whose only job would be to be good to provide labor. That's his good. And so Bantu education was geared at striking that mortal wound. And if you can do it as early as possible, then no matter what, if the job is done at an early stage, it is almost impossible to turn that around, or very difficult. And so I knew here was something wrong. And so what I did was, so of course I got into politics, I get into school politics, and there's a whole process that then unfolded. And I became aware and alert of the situation that I was in was not just because of our choosing, but there were bigger factors, bigger forces, not just because the color of my skin and I am worthless, which I thought at the time I was. I really thought. I had many times when I say, why the hell did God, why the hell did I come out brown? Couldn't I be white? So I had to work through all of that. Deep existential issues. They formed the basis of later engagement. So here I managed to go through a very long process of ultimately finishing university. First went to university, fell out, not because because I didn't have money. I was excluded. Oh, and by the way, I must say, there's a story with Black Sash, and I want to tell that story later on. And then I went back part-time, because I said one thing for sure, there's no way, no matter what, I am going to carry on. Even if it takes me 10, 20 years, I'm going to persist. I am going to carry on. And I eventually finished. But by that time, because of the deep reflection and trying to understand and make sense of the world around me, I had realized that, look, for me, law, and I'd already then resolved that I was going to become a lawyer. But I realized that there needed to be something that I wanted to do with it. Because of having experienced all of this, I wanted to use the idea of law. So I start off with a tool. It needed to speak to me. It needed to do something. Because where I'd come from was so horrendous that I said to myself, whatever I'm going to do, being a lawyer, no matter what, of course, I would want to have a nice, comfortable life. Make no mistake. But I said to myself, that's not going to be the overriding theme. Law for me had to be meaningful. It had to be the kind of tool that I could use in order to wrought social change. And where? for the very same people, communities, vulnerable groups we had come from. So now I start setting my practice in motion. And I'm now in a different world. And this is the world of law, the world of formality, and also the world of prom. Yeah? You know how lawyers are. And this world is strange to me. Yeah, it's a wonderful world, but it's also a world where I say I don't feel comfortable in. And I said, and I looked at it, and I, engagement, and said, you know what? I didn't want to do the ordinary law. There are many bright lawyers, that can do that. But I wanted to do something else. I wanted law to be able to, I wanted, law needed to change things, needed to change reality, needed to change people's lives, etc. And that's when I decided that, look, I started doing a little bit of criminal work. So all those gangsters, etc., were my clients. They were my wonderful clients because they were my peers. And they've committed the most horrendous crimes. And so, of course, yes, there were deep moral issues that I was confronted with. But they were my clients. And they were my friends. We were at school together. Because it was a question of maintaining the trust. And hopefully through your position, being able to also engage beyond just, being an attorney. But eventually I got into, and I said, look, I wanted to get into the kind of law that was meaningful. And that's how I landed up, focusing my attention on class action. Something that was different, that wasn't practiced, in South Africa. But I said, if all the lawyers are going that way, fine and well, I wanted to go slightly different. And that's where I got to it. And so this was, and a lot of it had to do with that upbringing, where I came from.
So I want to chat then a little bit about language and its use in the book. So the book is obviously written predominantly in English, but being from a community where Afrikaans was the first language, there are parts of the conversation in the book that are obviously written in Afrikaans. And I'm so interested in the multiple ways in which language plays a role here. So there is obviously the language of, again, that world, right? The language that's used by the gangsters, the way they speak to each other. And then there is the shift, and then there is this language of law. Now we're talking about, international customary law, we're talking about, precedent, we're talking about all of these legal technical terms. And so what I'm interested in is, what is it that you think happens in the book when you translate some of that Afrikaans language, so some of that really violent Afrikaans language, and part of it doesn't carry across into translation. I won't use the words, but there are words that can't be translated. And I guess what I'm getting at is I'm interested in the power of saying those words the way they're said, and you don't shy away from it. And they're not easy words to read. But there is something that you have to convey by using those words. It's the violence of what that language does to your ears as you hear it. And of course then the violence that happens when you grow up where that's just commonplace language. So I'm just wanting you to unpack a little bit your thinking. Did you have a moral dilemma of, do I put this word in the book, do I not? What was your thinking around the use of language?
Yeah, you really made good on the promise to say it's going to be a hard one, hey? Let me say the issue of the language was, I don't think it was a challenging one. It was a question of how frank was I going to be in writing this book? Because I knew that if I was going to write something that was a real reflection, at least in the written form, of the deep experiences, the language, crude, vulgar, almost the unsayable, almost the unspeakable, had to be part of it. So that's the one thing. And if it was going to be part of it, how was I going to able to weave that language into prose of telling a story, as hurtful and as painful as it was, and yet still trying to tell a beautiful story? And then to complicate it, having words like that permeating throughout the book in the context of some of the highest law. So I had to give thought to it. But I want to say that, so the very idea of language, so I grew up Afrikaans, and I'm still Afrikaans. And for most of my childhood life and young teen life, I couldn't speak English. I only spoke Afrikaans. But I also couldn't speak Afrikaans, because the Afrikaans that we spoke was not the Afrikaans that was acceptable. It was a bastardized form of Afrikaans, because there was a standaard beskaafde Afrikaans. And everyone, and so now, language in itself, in our own community, became one of distinction. Those who could speak Afrikaans a little bit better than the others were a notch above the others. And in fact, it still continues today. Okay? We sometimes try to speak this hoogdravende Afrikaans, which is no problem. There's no problem. I mean, now and then, in certain contexts, I do, speak it, etc. But the ones that were speaking these languages, at the level where we speak and we engage and we, all of it, that was our means of communication. Because the root of indigenous language were already cut centuries ago. I refer to it. Our indigenous forebears, spoke, Kwekwe, Kham, Gano, Naru. I had no relation to it. Don't even know, because it's been severed. That umbilical cord has been severed right there. And so all we did was a conversational language enough only to serve, not to rise to the level of being able to speak that engage, but only to serve. And so I say, I don't know, in the book I say, we did not speak, if I may just, read, but history wasn't kind to them, and I'm referring to the indigenous languages. The languages were systematically wiped out, and our ancestors, their descendants, ended up speaking Afrikaans and some English. My family spoke Afrikaans and only a little bit of English. We did not speak these languages the way white people did. I don't know whether our ancestors intentionally decided to make a mess of them or simply created their own homegrown dialect. Either way, we thrashed both languages, because the way in which we communicated, we couldn't care. So that was my entree into it. So I then grew up in that violent situation with the most common expression. And I recount stories of when I first used the most common expletive, which is yomasa. And when I had used that in a particular context, that was, I saw my back, and excruciating, because I was hit by my mother for using it. And of course, I wanted to understand and, realize that, look, what was the idea of this language was the curse of, when you say, this your master so-and-so, P, it is because you curse that other person or the mother of that person for having brought, that person into the world. But of course, notwithstanding my experience, I would continue to use it as almost a kind of defensive mechanism, warding off it's a knee-jerk response because this is what you see, how common it is used, and so on. So there's one experience where I had when I was ultimately refused to carry on at UWC. And I was very, very down. I didn't have funds. They wouldn't allow me to, carry on with my studies. And yeah, I was so, I tell you, it was one of the most lowest moment in my life when I was advised that I couldn't, carry on. And there everyone was playing wonderful, the Club of Jazz game. Everyone was going honky-dory. And I said, you're having fun time. All I want to do is to study. I want to become the lawyer. And yet, you're carrying on carefree, etc. And yeah, I've got to go. And then there is the moment when I landed up in the train at Unibelt Station. And I was down. Just as the train was moving. We were sitting, and two guys were sitting opposite me. And I thought they had pity on me, and they came over to me. I thought they were about to, move to the other side. And the next moment I realized they wanted to rob me. So they came sit near and they wanted to take me. And I was already down and out. And that moment I broke down, and the profanities that rolled off my tongue, you cannot believe it. And by the way, I also said that to UWC. But the point I want to make is that that was the gut response, because that's what I've grown up in it. There wasn't rational engagement. And it came from the deep. But don't worry, now and then, whenever I'm in a threatening situation, it's always there. It's always there. You can't take the bush out of, of me, no matter what. So yeah, I am in a different world. I am, some refer to as, and it's not the kind of theme that I like in the idea, on top of the, the food chain. I mean, it's not, I don't subscribe to it. But if you use the idea of a social ladder, having moved up from the very, very lowest to fairly high up. But there's never been a comfort. Never been a comfort, and I'm not specifically talking about, being, moving around, in the circles, of, in the law, and so on. Because the language that, use is a different kind of language. Eh? It is the one where you have, and of course, rightfully so, as lawyers, you've got to engage, you've got to maintain a particular posture, both in professional life as well as in personal life. Okay? I've always found it difficult for the simple reason is that the majority of my family is still in Brimway. They're still in Noitgeda. The social problems still continue. And quite frankly, when we engage each other, we engage robustly. And sometimes it requires a little bit of this, and it requires a little bit of that. And then the next moment when you go back to court, you just show up and you reassert your professional, posture and composure.
So let's talk a little bit then about this world of the Lanis, right? This world of law. And there's an extract in the book that I love, where you are speaking about how you have invested in the transformative power of law. And you say that each profession has transformative power, but you've put your money in the transformative power of law. And then you speak about how you don't see law as being the preserve of just judges and lawyers, and that really resonates with me because I too am slightly skeptical of how seriously the world of law takes itself. So what I want to talk about is you speak about how you attach a question mark to this word success, right? And so what I'm interested in is, what is it like to be at the top of the game, if we're going to use that kind of terminology, in a professional field where the issue of transformation constantly reminds you that you don't quite belong. And of course, you engage with it in the book, in the work that the case you and Richard were doing around, silicosis claims for gold miners. And I'm sure people here would have seen in social platforms what played out with Richard Spoor and the remarks that he made via social media regarding why the team for that particular case was all white. What does that do? Is that part of what makes you feel like it's useful to attach a question mark to the word success, because that world itself constantly sort of reminds you that you've arrived, but not quite?
Very good question. So fast forward. So by now I have been involved in probably four of the most important cases in South Africa. So the first one was outside of South Africa. I become the attorney involved in the apartheid litigation in New York, which litigation had run for almost 15, 16 years. At the same time, during that process or period, I then started focusing attention on how class actions could become a reality in South Africa. And that first opportunity came when the news, when we learned that there's been a bread cartel that had been operating for many, many years. It struck a very personal chord with me, a nerve, deep nerve, because there's a chapter in the book where I explain deep hunger, and where I had gone without bread, and there was even a situation where I actually fought, for breadcrumbs with my dog. And so here I am, many years later, regarded as fairly successful, and all of a sudden came this news. Collusion. Took me back to my childhood. My intuitive response? Bastards. Sorry, fucking bastards. But it was just the gut response, because, thinking back to my own personal experiences. And after a while, etc., we set in motion the first class action for damages in South Africa. We lost in the High Court. We took it up to the Supreme Court of Appeal. We prevailed, and another part of that case moved to the Constitutional Court. That also prevailed. Through that case and through the support of Black Sash and other organizations that came on board, we established law, precedent. That case in turn became the catalyst for the very, very big case that myself and another colleague set in motion, which is the class action against the largest gold mining companies in South Africa on behalf of mine workers who'd contracted silicosis and tuberculosis. And after many, many years, last year we concluded a 5 billion rand settlement on behalf of the mining company. Okay? So that's for me really the power of, when you believe, know that this is the right thing, and you persist no matter what. We've continued with that matter. We've been engaged in that matter for years, but we persisted because we felt that this was the right thing to do. But even within that, I had to engage with my peers, my colleagues. And everything is not always that rosy when you engage with your colleagues. We don't see the world through the same lenses, but they are important because they bring different skills. They bring different expertise to, the table. And so there are, for instance, my engagement with my colleague, Richard Spoor. Richard and I, he's another lawyer, and I think many of you may be familiar with it. He's very well-known occupational lung disease lawyers, and he's also the lawyer who's now taken on the listeriosis cases and so on. So him and I have had a relationship going back many, many years. But Richard is a very complex person. And Richard is a different kind of person, than me. And so, yeah, it came that in the course of, this litigation, and we had this, case before the court, and, we argued, and Richard went off on a tangent and said lots of things about black professionals that immediately raised the ire, of black professionals, including myself. And so I deal with this specifically in the book. So now it pitted me against him, a colleague of mine, with whom I had walked a very long path, and I know his commitment. I mean, there were times that we didn't even have money. And he said, Charles, we're going to persist. We must carry on. And here, having said certain things on social media, that is by implication also against me. And so these were the deep, issues, etc. And on reflection, I sometimes ask myself in my response, should I have come down, much stronger against him for having assailed the ability of black professionals? Should I have, done, otherwise? And I leave that, as started to say, judgment remains, because I use the term judgment. Judgment was reserved both in terms of whether my decision was correct and also in the context of the judgment, this. But let me, take that further, because, it's a very important, so that is a very specific, aspect, of the book. But it does deal with the broader issue of the profession as a whole. I have never really had great comfort of operating as a normal lawyer within the lawyering space, because the law for me was, and it still is, something different. And it is borne out by my, that commitment towards and what I call the deep politics, and not the kind of politics that we see, but the deep politics of transformation, the politics of, everything in society, whether you're a lawyer, whether you're a doctor, etc. There is a commitment towards a different society. And so you use the tools at your disposal, to try and achieve that. And so for me, law has been my tool. But that tool to affect certain changes in order to ensure that there's an ultimate, outcome of a different form of society. Politicians do it, through their political engagement and so on. I have done it through law. And that has often sometimes put me at loggerheads, because the perspective of my other colleagues have always been narrow. Okay? Whereas I've always looked at it in a much more broad, context. And so for me, that then carries on and into the idea of what do we understand by law. So I started off by saying, when my hopes was crushed of, wanting to become a doctor, I then, turned to become a lawyer because I wanted to right the wrongs. And so for a very long time, the idea of law as a tool. But then at the certain point in my life, I realized, but law is actually much, much, much more than just a tool. It is the very fabric of our lives that we try to express through a legal means, through law. But the fabric of our social life, our cultural life, our economic life. But what happens is that we often see that the two don't tie into each other. That's why we say when there is a fundamental breach of the of the Bill of Rights, because the Bill of Rights, it's supposed to be that the expression of who we are, of what we are. And so if we see the abject poverty, and yet the Bill of Rights, provides for, some of the basic fundamental rights, enshrined in the Constitution, and yet we see all of that, then there is something fundamentally wrong with either the underlying values or its expression within law. And so for me, it is ultimately wanting to see law to a great extent being able to really be that expression of bringing the values of the society that we have up to what we find expressed in written form, in the Bill of Rights, in our laws, etc. And that's not the preserve of lawyers or judges. We all have a stake in it, all of us, through our social engagement, through the work that Black Sash does, and all other society, and all other interested parties. We ought to own those spaces, and that for me is what the law is about. It cannot just be the domain of the judges, of the lawyers, because then it becomes an expert vocation. And that is what I think we need to resist.
So I'm going to ask you my closing question before we open it up. And my closing question is this. There is, for me, a striking continuity in the book. And I suppose that makes sense because there is a continuity in life, right? And so if you think about that young Charles born in a year, if that young Charles had been born yesterday in current day South Africa, there is still a chance that that young Charles would have been born in a sinkhokkie. There is still a chance that that young Charles would have had to use a pit latrine. There is still a chance that that young Charles would have been subjected to an inferior education system that would fail him by not making sure the textbooks arrive on time. What would your message be, not to the current day young Charles, but to yourself, your younger self, as you stand here on this end of the life of Charles Abrams? What is the message that this Charles Abrams would send back in a bottle to that young Charles Abrams who was born in a sinkhokkie in Elsiersrivier? It's got to be a hard one. It's got to be, obviously.
I thought it was going to be a little bit easier. But Nolita. So, but there's a very interesting aspect to the question. Because here I am, almost 50 years later. So I'm 52 now. So let's say 40, 45 years later. And you look back to that very same Charles then. The comforting part of that is that that very same Charles exists still today. Okay? So it is as sending the message back to that young child, it is sending the messages to the millions of other youngsters currently in similar, if not more, abysmal circumstances. Okay? But there is an issue about, and I use the term deep very deliberately, about deep education. And there is really an aspect about that. There is something that had propelled me, and I don't know what it is, quite frankly. There's a part in the book where I refer to this when and I want to read it because I think it really has bearing on what you have. And this was when reflecting back on when we were when the school inspector told me not to aim so high. So the experience at school was that the teachers started to see the kids from Breamway and the flats as what they call little squallies, young gangsters. And so we started to bear the brunt of, being just, having been, living in Breamway and, being in the flats. And so the little part that I want to read is the following. It says that, so whenever I think back to the day when the school inspector told me not to aim too high, I wondered whether this image of a little Scully was what he had in mind. So the hurt that it caused me still resonates. So many years later, I saw that hurt poignantly articulated in the movie called Scent of a Woman. So some of you may have seen it. When the blind lieutenant, Colonel Frank Slade, played by Al Pacino, defended a college student called Charlie before a school assembly. The principal wanted Charlie to name 3 other students who had engaged in a school prank. And if he does not, he will face expulsion. Slade, in a very highly charged retort, said to the principal, and this is the point that I want to get to. There was a time I could see, because Slade was blind. And I have seen boys like these, younger than these, their arms torn out, their legs ripped off. But there is nothing like the sight of an amputated spirit. There is no prosthetic for it. You think that you're merely sending the splendid young foot soldier back home with his tail between his legs. But I say you are executing his soul. Now that's how I felt that morning after the inspector's criticism. My spirit amputated and my soul executed. It was a dreadful feeling for which I could find no prosthetic. Yet, and this is it, there was a part of me that refused to let go. And I clung to whatever spirit I had left. I don't know if it was the daily drudge of Breamway and the flats that planted in me the seeds for my own survival. But it certainly awoke something deep inside of me, and I held onto it, whatever it is. And it's that spirit deep inside each one. The fact that you wake up amongst the most dreadful circumstances and you see the day through, still to wake up the following morning. That's phenomenal. Use that spirit. When I told my parents that I wanted to study law, they said, where the heck? My mother was very excited. She was over the moon. But none of us dared to touch the subject of tuition fees. Because where the hell are they going to get the money? But I had made up my mind, with the respect to the teachers. And they're doing a fantastic job. But I didn't want to become a teacher. Because the teacher was also the hallmark of that if you're going to excel, then you would only excel to become a teacher. And I didn't want to. But it was also because of my own dreadful experiences, in school. Lo and behold, I landed up. The only thing that I had was registration fees. I got money, managed to get some money. I didn't have anything else. Nothing. The end of the year, when it was pay-up time, and the university summoned me, there was a balance outstanding. But I was surprised to learn that the bulk of my tuition fees for that year was paid by the Black Sash. So, now, for those who know the Black Sash office, it used to be opposite, the railway station was it in Mowbray? No, I'm talking about the Mowbray first. Okay. Yeah, so that was still that time, okay, with the Mowbray offices. And I remember I once, went there and I gave in my name, etc. But I had no hope. But I was very surprised. And I can tell you now, so the Black Sash is also part of the journey of the success. So thank you so much.
Hi, good evening, everybody. I'm Ivan, and I come from Bishop Lavis. And I read the book, and I want to say I'd like to share this with the rest of you guys. We must take Charles Abrams out of the book and put yourself in that book. Because there's a saying that goes, if you don't know your history, you're about to repeat yourself, right? And what comes out of this book is that we have all been in a Breamway. We have all been in a Bishop Lavis. And So where we were, where we are, and where we're going to. And the challenge in this book is, where are we going to? And once we've identified that and say the Breamways and the Bishop Levers and Valapak and Mannenberg, there are so many Charles Abramses that can come out of there. It is if we navigate that and get that Charles Abramses out of that. Thank you, Charles, for bringing this lovely, navigating the story of saying we can. And thank you that we can use this book as telling our children we can be. And we can free ourselves from mental slavery. And we can go forward. Thank you.
My subject is English, and I'm amazed that you can have reached this level of fluency, of ability to communicate in the language from the background you have, because I've taught both in high schools and mostly in adult education, and I know the enormous struggle that people with a similar background often have. And I'd be very interested to know your journey of gaining this fluency, and this partly comes from your passion, perhaps a little from your lay preacher father, because maybe he bequeathed to you a certain ability to communicate. But can you give us, I mean, you quoted Dante, could you give us some idea of your reading history and that kind of thing? I'm interested as a linguist.
I was a bit shocked at the personal aspect of it, especially the introduction. But it also pointed to the question of how our personal journeys shape where we end up. And what stood out for me, your question with success, the question mark that you have, and your sister, when you're in New York, and your sister calls you for help, and she asks you, where is New York? That stood out for me, because the question of success is very subjective, depending on where you are and where you want to go. So I commend you for the book, but also it points out, like you say, you know, being a lawyer, doing class action is not necessary success, but it is the journey to get there that shapes who you are, that can be successful, where you always remember and you still have the relationship with your family who are still where you originated from. So thank you.
Ivan and I, you know, we grew up together. We shared many of the same experiences, same stories, more or less same kind of situations and so on. And we often speak about our experiences. You know, I don't sometimes wonder whether it is, you know, when you kind of reach your 40s and then all of a sudden all of these things start to come up. You thought you could, you know, you've buried it deep down, but, you know, the more and more and more, you know, you are into, you know, that, you know, 40s and over, the more and more you're confronted with it. And you sometimes, you know, have to decide either you want to try and, you know, run away from it, or you're going to confront it and, you know, deal with it. And so class action is very much also that kind of, you know, thing of really to say. So there was a deep sense, and I know I'm what is it, away from it, but there was a sense when, you know, at one stage with all the things that has happened to me, I mean, of course, if you read the story, I was, you know, also as a child, you know, sexually molested, you know, and all of that, it's in the book. And so now you reach success, and now you're in a different world, and you're in the world of lawyers. You know, your immediate survival is no longer there. You're middle class now. You are on top of your game. I travel the world, whether I'm in New York, I'm in Europe, I'm in, you know, etc., all over. And your childhood is still there. And now it's a question of, do I put a cloak over it? Because now you engage with your peers, your white peers, and they don't necessarily, and I'm saying not necessarily, come from the same experience that we have, you know, been subjected to. But because it's also a very competitive environment, it's an environment of being able to almost stand your ground and be able to say that you've arrived and so on. The personal, the intimate, is very shallow when you engage. You don't go too deep. You talk about and you engage about the now, about your successes. And you translate that into your nice, comfortable life, the car that you drive. It's a semblance of success. It bothered me. And I got to a point and I said, no, this is nonsense. Because I want to be who I am. Because this is part of what we call the authentic, to own your own agency, who you are, no matter what. And so class action was very much about that. Here you've arrived, but I've arrived at what? I've arrived at a little bit of material comfort. Nice little car. Is that it? Where there are millions of others who are excluded. And I must now celebrate that as the success. By no means, and I'm not saying that we should not, because we should own it and we should celebrate it. But it is not the kind of success, because what happens is that we are held out as the role models, and rightfully so. But as if to suggest that if I can make it, yes, you can make it, but without questioning the social foundations, the economic foundations, the politics. Okay? If we create enabling conditions and environment in our communities, many more, the great talents, many more, undoubtedly will emerge. We can take our communities and our societies to levels that we've never seen before. And it is what I call, if we allow enabling spaces. On the issue of language, if you listen carefully, you're a linguist. It's not all smooth. It's choreographed. No, I'm kidding. So there's a part in the book where I speak about the year that I spent in the library. So I finished my matric. So, well, the 1985 came. It was the year of my matric. I didn't, write in my matric exams, and I only wrote it in March the following year, in 86. I couldn't go to university. I then decided, you know what? This education, because I got an inkling that, there's something deeply wrong with, the education that we've been subjected to. And I then, out of my own, for one solid year, every single day, got up, took the train, went to the library, and spent an entire year in the library, immersing myself in each and every book that I could find, whether it was philosophy, politics, religion, you name it. That's what I did. And in the process, I brushed up on English. I went to Lynette's dad and I said, please, Uncle Lenny, you've got contacts at the university. All I want to do is I want to study. Can you get me into the law university again? Hoping that I would be able to, continue with my study. Uncle Lenny came back about a week or so and he said, I was so excited. He says, Charles, I've got good news for you. Very good news. I managed to get you into university. I was excited. And then the next moment he said, it's in the theology faculty. Hey. Uncle Lenny, obviously being, a reverend, it was a deep, to swallow, and I swallowed it. But I was so passionate about it that I seized the opportunity. Part of the challenge that I now have is that being working in this middle class environment, the temptation is easy for you to succumb to that, to the point that you might forget. And so Amanda was, when I was in New York, and I was with the Khuluma case, etc., and I am in one of the hotels, etc., and she calls here and she's shouting at me, where are you? Can't you come home? They're having an argument and a quarrel. I said, Amanda, relax. Because I'm in New York. where the fuck is New York? Amanda, it's in America. Bang, the phone down. And so for me, that stood out, and I say, you know what? I hope that just as she didn't know where New York was, I hope that I don't get to the point where I forget when Nooit Gedacht, is.